Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review. I'm Kate.
I'm Laura.
And this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
Today we're discussing Lullaby by French-Moroccan author Leïla Slimani, the book read most recently by my book club. It's a darkly suspenseful novel and opens with the unforgettable words, "The baby is dead. It took only a few seconds." Critics found it gripping and thrilling in equal measure, but what did my book club make of it? Did it spark debate? And whether we loved it or loathed it, the big question is, was it a great book club book? Keep listening to find out.
And we round off the show with some recommendations for your next book club read, inspired by Lullaby.
That's all coming up here on the Book Club Review.
Hi Laura.
Hi Kate.
We're delighted to be joined in the studio today by my dear friend Chloe Dunbar, who I've never been in a book club with.
Hello.
Hi Chloe, welcome.
Thank you.
We live on opposite sides of London. I feel like if we were closer, we might be in a book club together. On the other hand, we have such good chats about books whenever we meet. I don't need to be in a book club with you.
Yeah, we do. No, I would love to do that more regularly, though.
Are you in another book club, Chloe?
Well, I'm not. For my job, I do a huge volume of reading, which actually means, really quite sadly, that a lot of my reading for pleasure is quite limited. But I am constantly reading, and I feel like my job is actually almost one long book club, because almost daily I need to come in with a quite in-depth rationale and review of a book that I've been reading.
That's all very
we should explain.
Intriguing.
Yeah. Chloe has what many readers would consider to be a dream job, in that she works for a film production company and her job is to source books that would make great films. So I imagine there's quite a lot of pressure to really...
There is. I mean, often a book will come in and you will literally have sort of 24 hours before a feeding frenzy begins, and you have to read it at high speed. And also, often for me, one of the challenges is you have to read books or genres that you wouldn't normally be drawn to, but you know this might be the great fantasy series that will beat Game of Thrones. So I do constantly find myself having to challenge myself with my reading, and that's been really interesting and actually something I've enjoyed as well, because I've found treasures and things that I've really enjoyed dipping into.
And then we came along and we made you read Lullaby for this show. But had you read it in the course of your work?
I had read it for my work, and I'd almost instantly tried to kind of pursue the film rights to it. And lo and behold, it is, I think, currently in production in France and being made by Marwen, who is a French filmmaker. And it will be coming to the French cinema screens, I think, relatively soon. But the English language rights become available in 2020. So watch this space. Who knows? By the end of the discussion, we can decide whether we think it will make a good film or not.
I think that is a good question, because you would have to say, is this book filmable? But let's tell people about this book, shall we, Laura?
Sure. Okay, so Lullaby tells the story of a French couple who hire a nanny to look after their 2 young children while they are at work. And they find their dream candidate in Louisa, a quiet, polite and devoted woman who sings to their children, cleans their apartment and cooks delicious meals. But as the couple and their nanny become increasingly codependent, jealousy, resentment and suspicion sets in. Lullaby sold over 600,000 copies in France and won their most prestigious literary prize, the Prix Goncourt, and it's been translated into 18 languages, with more still to come. The English translation that we read was by Sam Taylor. I would like to make this point that I did not want to read this book. This is important to me to say, because in the past I've talked about how I managed to steer my book clubs towards kind of books I really want to read, and that did not happen with Lullaby. I was very much overruled by a democratic process.
I think that's a really, really good point. That's not a spoiler, this first sentence about the baby being dead. That's on the cover. Mm-hmm. She wanted you to know that. And I had to steel myself to read this. I have young children and a baby, and I have a French nanny. So I was really like, oh, can I read this? But I knew that she had children, and I just thought, if she had children and she could write this, I can read this. And then once I picked it up and got started, there was no question in my mind. I felt like I needed to read it. It's interesting, isn't it? And I know another one of our guests, Chloe Sharma, when she was here, do you remember she said that she had recommended it to her book club and they just refused to read it? They wouldn't consider it.
Because they were mothers.
But so should people be put off?
It's interesting. Quite a few of the reviews that I've read have made a point which I think is really interesting, basically saying that they sort of started the book and read those incredible first 4 words. And it is such an incredibly striking, chilling, bold way to start a book, to put the biggest event of the book in the first line. And then they have all said that it is an unbelievably propulsive read, considering that you are told up front, and it obviously is a kind of why done it. And they have said that they spent the rest of the book trying to escape those first 4 words, and that you almost feel you have to finish it to get away from that opening horror. And I have to say, because, as I've said, because of my job, I did read it very early and before a lot of the press came out for the book. And yes, Kate, you were quite high on my list of people to text to say, do not read this book.
But I think there's a wonderful interview I should flag up on another podcast called Literary Friction, and they had her on. And she said that she wanted to explore her own worst fear as a mother.
Yes.
And I felt like this reading it. I felt like that's what I was doing. I was exploring that awful fear that, you're really haunted by in some tiny low-level way every moment, from having a child to presumably when you die, you can stop worrying about them. And I just sort of respected that. I thought, this is worth reading. I'm going to learn something from this.
My very clever book club flagged that the opening line recalls Camus' opening for The Stranger, L'étranger. Aujourd'hui, maman est morte.
Yeah, which is incredibly famous. And I think any French person reading this would then have all kinds of interesting sort of underlying thoughts about, existentialism and that literary tradition, which I have read The Stranger, but I have to say that was all rather lost on me. I think it's okay, though. I don't think you need to know about Camus and existentialism in order to appreciate this.
We did have a discussion, though, about how this book has been marketed in the UK and the fact that it has been described as a thriller. And we did find it a little bit pulpy. I mean, some people thought it was much better than others. But in France, obviously, that's not the case if it's won the most prestigious literary prize around. So there may be a bit of a disconnect between how different cultures are responding to it.
It's hard, isn't it? Because I think any book that's sort of starts with such a kind of gobsmacking opening and then clips along with the pace that it does and the tension that it does. I would say I definitely didn't find it pulpy. It was an unbelievably confronting and uncomfortable read, and it got under my skin like few contemporary books have recently. It's pulpy in the fact that it is, like Kate said, it is the manifestation of every mother's worst nightmare. But then it's so interestingly explored, and one of the things I found so unbelievably challenging and interesting about the book was that I really like those very difficult and uncomfortable protagonists, that by the end of the book you really have travelled so deeply into Louisa's psyche that by the time you close the book you feel like the only logical conclusion for her was the death of those 2 children. I found that socially thought-provoking in a way that I haven't felt many other books.
So my book club were very much in the same mindset, and I was the total outlier who just thinks I continue to think that it's a bit rubbish and pulpy and sensational. My view of it was tainted by this piece that Leïla Slimani has written at the very back of my edition.
Oh, mine doesn't have that.
I have the same edition as you, and at the very end it has a short essay called Muamma by Leïla Slimani.
Does it?
Does yours? Do you have the Q&A at the end?
No, mine doesn't have any of these
So
things.
I think the publisher has possibly added more content at the end as the success has occurred. I'm not sure. In this short little essay, Leïla Slimani talks about her childhood nanny, who was from Morocco, who spoke to her in Berber, and her name was Muamma. And she raised the children up until they were sort of teenagers, at which point kind of a space and alienation opened up between the children, who were now becoming teenagers, who were educated, were feeling separate from their nanny. They'd kind of grown out of her, and she didn't speak French. She apparently couldn't read, and the relationship really broke down between the family, and she just left one day. And bafflingly, Leïla Slimani dedicates this book to her, which I couldn't quite comprehend. I was like,
I can too.
What?
Because one of the many interesting things that she's exploring in this book is the role of nanny.
Yes, but the role of nanny who kills her wards at the end. I found it quite offensive. There is a case, this was based on a case of a nanny killing her children.
She's called after Louise Woodward, who was in the mid-90s, the British au pair who killed.
Yeah, there was that, although I think that there was some question over whether that was deliberate or not. But certainly there was a case in New York of the Krim children, I think it was, 2 children who were killed by their nanny. And that's I think that was the direct inspiration.
Yes.
But no, to go back to the point about nannies, I mean, you're right, but strangely, I don't connect that, what I take from it is the exploration of this role of nanny, this sort of pseudo-mother, this woman who you want to be intimate with your children, to replace you, and yet at the same time, ultimately, you're always going to take them away from her. And very much at the end of this book, what happens is the children are outgrowing the nanny. There's a line where it says, soon Adam will go to school. Yeah. And what will Louise do? And she's desperate because by this point, she can't bear to lose this family that she's become such a part of. And she starts this strange campaign, doesn't she, to try and get the mother to have another baby. Yes. But that's true of that job, that nanny role. It's an extraordinary job where they have to replace you for a certain time and then they have to just say goodbye and move on to the next family. And I've always thought it was kind of an extraordinary role. And I think one of the interesting things about this is it's such a strange context for doing it, but nonetheless, for me, that was very much one of the things that I was thinking about when I read this and kind of reflecting on and considering. I like the way that she held that up and made me really think about it.
But of course, most nannies move on, maybe with much heartbreak, but they do not kill their wards. So for me, that was just kind of fed into not just maybe mother's worst fear, but society's worst fear, and this idea that mothers shouldn't leave their children at home and the risk of leaving your children with another human being.
There was a midpoint in the book where I definitely felt, oh gosh, is this just another way to beat working mothers? It's kind of like an absolute realisation of every working mother's cold-blooded fear that this is what's going to happen to their children. But at the same time, I thought ultimately it shone a light on some really uncomfortable truths about how women who feel that they can have it all, what it actually requires to prop that up. That we do ask for this incredible emotional labour and intimacy from other women in order to have the careers we want or have the lives we want. I felt like it was full of such acute social observations about that socioeconomic difference between the two women and how one woman relied on another woman to prop up her world and make her world perfect. This kind of chain of caregiving that at the beginning of the book you have Miriam saying, I feel like my children are kind of leeching the lifeblood out of me. And then pretty much what she does is leech the lifeblood out of another woman in order to thrive and flourish, and you see her suddenly living this life that she feels she's entitled to and she feels she deserves, but at the expense of another woman. And I thought it was really challenging and really questioning of what it is we ask from other women. And I think books like this provoke this much more honest conversation about we need to acknowledge that women do not miraculously, because they are brilliant mothers or because they deserve it, have these freedoms. Those freedoms are bought by economic advantage.
What about the men? Because you haven't mentioned Paul once, and he's the worst.
To be honest, because it felt like such a psychologically acute silent warfare going on between Louise and Miriam, I felt quite quickly that I was just utterly disinterested in him. I just thought he was a bit of a pig. He, to me, just didn't feel like the character that was memorable in the story.
Oh, absolutely not. But I would sort of argue that most of the characters, other than Louise, are sort of half-cooked. Miriam is there to be the working mother. And I found this to be a flaw. Again, my clever book club were like, no, they're archetypes. This is an investigation into class warfare and oppression, and they're just archetypes. It's very French. And I was like, oh, well, I also like my characters to be well-rounded and not just cliches.
I thought she was pretty complex, though. I thought there was quite a lot of complexity to her. It's quite a cruel portrait of her because she is revealed in all of her dislikability. But I think that opening section where she describes that huge loss of self that having children for many women does bring, and she gave that sense of really what work meant to her, what it meant to her identity, and you saw how much of the emotional load of the family she was carrying. I felt that was all really beautifully depicted and quite nuanced. And then there were bits that were much harder to read, like the fact she didn't want a North African nanny because she wanted to kind of hold the upper hand of status. She didn't want another woman who had a background like hers, and I thought that was all really fascinating.
I'm dying to read a bit. Can I read a little bit
go on.
From early on when Paul and Miriam are preparing to interview their prospective nannies? That morning, they went to the market together, all four of them, Mila on Paul's shoulders, Adam asleep in his pushchair. They bought flowers, and now they are tidying up the apartment. They want to make a good impression on the nannies who will come here. They pick up the books and magazines that litter the floor around and under their bed, and even in the bathroom. Paul asks Mila to put her toys away in large plastic trays. The little girl refuses, whining, and in the end he piles them up against the wall. They fold the children's clothes, change the sheets on the beds. They clean, throw stuff away, try desperately to air this stifling apartment. They want the nannies to see that they are good people, serious, orderly people who try to give their children the best of everything. The nannies must understand that Miriam and Paul are the ones in charge here. Mila and Adam take a nap. Miriam and Paul sit on the edge of their bed. Anxious, uncomfortable. They have never entrusted their children to anyone before. Miriam was in her last year at law school when she became pregnant with Mila. She graduated 2 weeks before the birth. Paul was getting more and more work placements, full of the optimism that had drawn Miriam to him when they first met. He was sure that he'd earn enough money for both of them, certain that, despite the financial crisis, despite budget restrictions, he would forge a career in the music industry. I think one of the things that's so interesting about this book is the way that she engages your empathy with these characters, but then she switches it around, so you're never quite sure. And actually, I wasn't able to write off Paul. There's a scene where they go to stay with his parents, and suddenly you have some insight into his mind and what he's thinking and what he's feeling. And I love that about this book. And Louise, the nanny, she's not a monster at the beginning. You sort of witness her become a monster, and there are times when you do sympathise with her. And I agree with Chloe. I think at the end, what's genius about this book is the way that there's just a kind of inevitability about it. You always know what's going to happen, but by the end, you're not surprised. It seems like the only conclusion because you're so invested in her point of view. And that's really clever, to make you empathise and understand someone who commits such a horrific act, such an unthinkable act. You can barely bear to read about it on the page. And I think we should say as well, just to reassure people, I think the worst part of this book is probably the first page and the last page. Yeah. And the rest of it's really fine, It's going to be okay. It's not going to traumatise you reading it.
I mean, if anything, I felt like at times she almost deliberately, she does that sort of such a shocking kind of opening. And like you said, by the end, you're in a state of sweaty dread. But I think a lot of the book is written with this quite calm detachment and is quite matter of fact and is sort of observational in a way that is really interesting because it creates such a huge tension as you're going through it. And I think in some ways it's obviously turning the dial massively up on what a lot of people's experience is. But I think there's also huge parts of it that are extremely relatable for a lot of women from lots of different perspectives.
There's a couple of things I thought she really nailed. One was the ambivalence that you can feel towards your own children. It's something it's hard to even say out loud, but she captured it absolutely brilliantly. You love them more than life itself. You would throw yourself in front of a truck to save them in a second without even thinking about it. And yet at the same time, they can be quite annoying. And, frequently you wish they weren't around. Yeah. I thought she did that brilliantly because what it is, of course, is that loss of self and that loss of identity and having to subjugate your own desires. Everything has to be poured into raising these children. And that's really difficult for a human being. I think any human being, that's a really tough thing to do. And there's a wonderful section I really related to where before Louise comes along and Miriam's struggling to do it all herself, she goes to a supermarket and ends up stealing something. I can't remember if it was intentional. I think she did quite quietly take it.
I think she did it by mistake the first time.
But she knew.
And then she started to repeat it because of the thrill.
Because she knew that even if she had been caught, she would have just played the sort of stressed out. And there are two things there. One is that invisibility. No one is going to be looking at her. And that's true. When you're a tired, not very attractive looking mum because you're exhausted and you haven't put makeup on and you're pushing the buggy around, no one will see you. You're invisible practically. And also then you just have this, oh God, and people will let you get away with anything. And it's true. And I have done that. I accidentally took a bottle of wine from Waitrose once, and I found only because it was underneath the buggy. And when I got out, I had exactly the same thought. I saw it there. I thought, should I take it back? And I was like, oh no, no one's going to have noticed. And they didn't. Unlike Miriam in the book, I didn't then go back and start making a habit of it.
Stealing wine from Waitrose.
What it really brought home to me is that invisibility and how sort of dehumanizing that can be. And when you're a new mother, you don't have that. When your children are older and they start school, this sort of magical thing happens that no one tells you about, which is you get this network of fellow parents and you're all there in the trenches together. And suddenly you've got a tribe and you have an identity again. And that really helps, I think. But when they're really little, unless you've been fortunate enough to make fantastic friends with your NCT group or something like that, you're very alone and isolated. And I just thought all of that was so well done. I was completely engaged with all of that.
No one in my book club is a mother. Is that true?
But what are we saying though? Am I saying I think you need to be a mother to really understand this book and to get something out of it? I don't feel that can be true.
What I was going to say is that no one is a mother as yet. I mean, actually, Miranda is a mother, but Miranda is currently in the trenches with a 6-month-old baby.
In the early days.
And we haven't seen her in 7 months. Hi, Miranda. But what my book club picked up on much more than motherhood and the commentary that this book brings to motherhood, my book club picked up on class. They felt this was very much a commentary on class, and that actually, of course, Louise had to kill the children because that was the natural outcome of this sort of class warfare and exploitation by this middle-class couple who don't want to see the dirty underside of their cheap labour propping up their bourgeois lifestyles.
I think that's interesting. I don't think she is cheap labour. I think they pay her well and they treat her well. I think that's one of the nuances that made me like it.
I don't know.
Well, I mean,
getting really practical. Why is she on the hook for the hospital expenses of her ex-husband? Because France has the equivalent of the NHS, no? I just get really practical. When I don't know something, I'm like, so why does she have all this debt?
Well, and there are definitely some points in the plot where you just feel like the author needed there to be reasons why Louise is living in a tiny one-room apartment
that's
in a
crumbling,
very impoverished area. She cared enough about this character to want to give her a psychological background for why she then might become the way she became. And the whole history with the ex-husband and, yes, previous employers, all of that fed into that. But it did feel to me like that was where the invention was, and I didn't really worry too much about it. Didn't want to pick holes in it.
I worried.
I think you could.
I was very prepared to pick holes in it.
I think you could if you really wanted to.
That's the problem with coming to a book with a lot of baggage and prejudice, is that you don't.
Well, yeah, because the other thing was
I didn't find it a page turner.
The other thing
I
was
dreaded picking it up.
She was well paid. She wasn't badly paid.
How do we know she was
so
well
why
paid?
couldn't she pay her bills? Why couldn't she pay her rent?
How do we know she was well paid?
I'm sure they pay her a reasonable amount because they're struggling on their salaries to afford her.
I did get the feeling that she wasn't paid that badly.
Yeah.
But I never, because they didn't want an illegal immigrant.
They set up the debt that she's been saddled with through the husband. To me, I have to say that felt pretty believable in the sense that I think obviously one of the things that she was depicting in the novel is that character's intense isolation and how lonely she was. And I thought all the bit about her going back to her room and manically cleaning it and then having to go to the grubby shower with the rotten shower curtain and I think if it's not a truth for that character, it feels like a larger truth for every person who cleans a hospital corridor in a London hospital or drives a bus. It's about the people who service our lives and whether they're living in a way that's fair or
happy.
Or
Lets them meet their basic needs and move on from that to have a more fulfilling life.
There's something I think much more uncomfortable and kind of closer to home in the way that she sort of skewers the aspirational middle-class couple and their lifestyle and the way that they sort of try to have the right ideas and they want to do the right thing and they don't want to be racist or classist, and yet at the same time they want to have these barriers. They absolutely need to know,
and they want what they want.
They're
not willing to sacrifice anything they want
and
in the face of these ideals.
It sets it up beautifully, doesn't it? Because at the beginning there they know exactly what they want and that's what they think they're going to get. And then the gradual crumbling and erosion of that dream. To me, this novel was exploring the impossibility of that state that they aspired to, because you can't have it. And similarly, the impossibility of being the perfect mother, because you can't. It doesn't exist. It's not a valid idea. It's not a real thing. And it's misleading, this sense that we have, as you were saying, Chloe, that, we can do it all or you can have it all. You can't. And the thing is, I think one of the reasons perhaps that when you become a new parent, and it is also crushing and isolating, is because you realise that almost immediately. And it's like an undoing of the self. And then as your children grow older, gradually you piece yourself back together. And then what you're left with is what you go on with. That's what it does, I think, having children. And I don't know, is it a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know. But I think Leïla Slimani absolutely understands that. And to me, that came through this novel.
And I thought her social observations of the French middle class were really acute and often really funny. I mean, even the scene, which I'm sure we'll go on to talk about, which was the very shocking scene with the chicken carcass, when Louise takes the chicken carcass out of the bin and the children sort of nibble and polish it clean, and she leaves it out as a kind of act of violence, basically, against the mother on the kitchen counter. But the line that always makes me really giggle is when she says that the children wash it down with large glasses of Fanta, because she knows that organic middle class middle-class parents, the nightmare that their children have drunk a large glass of Fanta under the watch of the nanny, that's, and those microaggressions in the same way when they talk at the dinner party about how wonderful their nanny is and how she cooks this amazing food for them and mends their clothes and puts little lavender bags in their drawers. I thought she was so astute in the way that she sort of skewered everybody's.
Yes.
Said, how cynically Louise knew how to play to what they felt that they needed in terms of this picture-perfect lifestyle, and also how their liberalism was actually so surface. And, right at the beginning, there's that conversation where they say when they look for a nanny, what do they present? Sort of no smoking, no veils.
No illegal immigrants.
But Miriam tries to do the right thing in that moment. She said... Miriam thanked her for the advice, but in reality what Emma had said upset her. If an employer had spoken about her or one of her friends in that way, she would have cried discrimination. To her, the idea of ruling a woman out of a job because she has children is terrible. She prefers not to bring the subject up with Paul.
She feels the right thing. She hasn't done the right thing. She ends up with a nanny who doesn't have any children. And when Louise is sick, only that one time, all hell breaks loose. And she thinks that, the nanny's run off. And actually, no, it's just that Louise is ill.
Can't get
but
out
it's
of bed.
going to ruin Miriam's day. She has to go to court.
Mm.
I thought that Miriam was taken to the extreme because she is so much the working mother. Just in the sense that she doesn't even try to get home on time to see her children. And this seems to just become the norm. And why did she have to be pushed that far, I wondered? Why did she have to be such an extreme workaholic?
I don't know, because her profession is she's a lawyer, and all the lawyers I know seem to have to work pretty hard. The rewards are great, but you have to work hard and be quite ruthless, I think. And I think she's shown that's who she is.
Well, that is who she is. But
she
of course,
can't-
she is an anomaly in the law firm she works at, because they talk about how she's in before everyone else.
Yes, that's
And
true.
she stays later, and people don't expect her to come to drinks because she has children. She chooses again and again not to go home to her children. And just for me, that kind of broke down a little bit of the subtlety where we're not supposed to be judging her, because...
I think you are supposed to be judging her.
Yes, I think you are. I thought as a woman who's been out of the workplace for a few years, having a baby, that she'd want to go back, she'd want to make an impact. And also slightly, I think... what it explores is that Faustian pact, that when someone is at home and they seem to be carrying the domestic load with a kind of ease and a competence that you yourself can't muster, you retreat into the thing you think you're doing well, which is your career, and think there's this perfect woman at home who is wonderful with my children, who is cooking all my meals. And it explores in the book also some of the resentment that breeds, doesn't it? That actually, ultimately, she does end up feeling that her personal realm has been violated by this woman, which is obviously inevitable.
Well, that's what I was going to say. So fair enough to that. But what do we think about... Let's talk about the chicken carcass. I mean, this is a moment of violence, as you said. And this is a moment where Miriam breaks down. And they still keep her around.
But I think that's just to do with that's storytelling. It's a novel. She's ratcheting up the tension. At that point, you're screaming. You're like, oh, God, please fire her now. This is not normal. Obviously, this isn't normal. But in the book, she comes home, she discovers this thing. She tells the husband. The husband says, oh, you're overreacting. She thinks, well, maybe I am overreacting. And she did know that Louise didn't like her throwing out-of-date food away. And she had thrown away this chicken. There's a thing about how she secretly takes the bin bags out with food. She's sort of too lazy to sort out, just throws it away and secretly takes the bin bags out so Louise doesn't find it because she knows Louise will be upset. So then this chicken carcass coming back to haunt her there on the kitchen table. But in a way, there's been a little game going on for a while. She herself isn't psychologically innocent totally. Again, it's not black and white.
Well. I mean, as an image in a book, it's so memorable.
Oh my goodness!
And when she sort of polishes it with oil, and it's on.
I was going to say, because it's not just that the children have licked it
It's
clean.
sitting
She's
there
then
gleaming.
washed
almond
it.
oil with. And I thought, what an amazing image, and also it carries such foreboding when it comes in the book, because you've opened with this thing about the little bones of the children, and you just think, oh my, at that point, it's all too late.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I think is really fascinating, is by the time you get to that point, you are then watching the ball roll down the hill. You think this is now happening.
Yeah.
I thought it was just a brilliantly shocking pivot point in the book.
We talked about how Louise was able to inhabit this childhood world, this world of children.
And the world of play.
And how there was something kind of regressive about her. She'd never fully matured into a real adult, and that's why she could tell these fantastic stories, and that's why she could give herself over to these games. But like a fairy tale, there's a dark side to that.
And she wears this Peter Pan collar, doesn't she, which is often her uniform, which is depicted on the cover, actually. And that, again, that evokes the safe world of childhood games. But Louisa's games aren't safe, are they?
No.
And her stories aren't safe stories.
And that first time that she does something which slightly makes you short of breath is when she plays the game of hide and seek and she hides for too long. And then she enjoys watching the children's distress as they realise she isn't there. And that is one of the first moments where you see that sort of power play between them going into that very dark direction. But I also think, in some ways, isn't what she wants to present to the couple is this Mary Poppins fantasy, is a kind of neutralised, unwomanly, unworldly sense of herself. If she came and said, I'm someone who's been in an abusive relationship, I'm saddled with debt, I've got my own daughter, that's not what that couple want. That couple want the smiling, uniformed woman who has a childlike playfulness, who's going to unquestionably get on their children's level and not have any of her own more complicated adult or womanly concerns.
And so, was it a good book club book?
Well, I have to say, I was downright bullied. Not in one book club, not even just in the Lullaby, but in two, because we talked about it again. And and everyone was just like, no, Laura, no, you don't understand. No, they're archetypes. It's fitting in with French literature. Now, to be fair to my book club, I didn't read this book with much devotion. And therefore, a lot of my initial observations may have been a bit glib, given that they were based on a very light skim read of something I did not want to read. And even right now, I have had to skim read the last 50 pages because I did not want to read this book. But I don't like thrillers to begin with.
I see this description of it as a thriller. I don't.
Well, I didn't find it suspenseful. We know what's going to happen.
You do, but so I suppose for all those reasons, it didn't ever feel like a genre novel for me. And I was really surprised to read in the quotes on the cover, someone referred to it as the next Gone Girl.
Yes,
and I was like, Gone Girl?
Yeah, that's mad.
I think I'd always approached it the way I tend to sort of approach any French literary sensation, which is I assume it's just going to be sort of philosophical and French.
Indefinably French.
And so I wasn't ever sort of struggling to place it or frame it in any way. I was really content just to let her take me. And she sort of had me from the first sentence, and she did not put me down until the last. And I read it in one go.
Oh my God.
On the sofa, because I couldn't tear my eyes away. But it wasn't a horrible experience. I was pleased to have read it because I felt like I learned so much from it. And I just think the writing, to me, the thing about Camus and L'Étranger is it's beautifully precise. He wrote it in quite this sort of simple language. And again, it tells this quite shocking tale in a way. You know, she was evoking that. She did it beautifully. There wasn't a word wasted. It was precise. I loved the way, I think she said in the interview, when you're writing about ambiguity, you have to be precise and you have to be clear. And I loved the way that this did that. I thought it was beautifully translated. I never felt there was a word out of place. I never questioned the fact that it was French. You know, it just felt to me very vivid and real. And I think that's credit to the translation. And so, yeah, not only did I think it was an extraordinary story, but I just thought it was a masterclass in good writing. And so for me, it was just a pleasure. It was a horrible pleasure.
You see, I think I had the opposite experience of you, which is that because obviously I read it at this very early point, so there hadn't been this kind of tsunami of reviews and it hadn't yet built that sort of head of steam that the book's obviously got at this point. And I can perhaps imagine reading it through a slightly more cynical filter, having had the fact it has been so hyped, and I think that positioning of it as a thriller is wrong. I wonder also whether I was drawn to it because of its Frenchness and because it was Paris, and maybe if it had been set in Bournemouth as well, it would have been a bit less interesting.
A little less glamorous.
Yeah, and I think it was this kind of violent, intriguing, dirty, lonely Paris that sort of isn't the Paris of literature that we kind of know, and I found that really intriguing and exciting. I'm interested to know what the men of your book club thought about it.
They really enjoyed it.
Readers, did they?
They did really enjoy it. Phil and Stu were robust debaters with me in my lazy opinions, not having read the book properly. And they did very much pick up on this idea that it was about class. I was talking about how I didn't think the characters were very well developed, and Phil pointed out that they're not meant to be characters, they're supposed to be archetypes, and he resents the fact that in English literature we tend to think that characters have to be developed and well-rounded, and actually, you know, in other literary traditions that's not the case. And I was like, oh, right, Phil, fine. Sure. But it was a lesson in the fact that if you're going to have strong opinions about your book club book, you probably should read it forensically beforehand in order to be able to hold your ground rather than retreat into sulkiness in the corner. But yeah, I think it was a great book club book. Maybe not for me.
I thought also, as a depiction of motherhood, it is so fraught with all the contradictions that feel inherent in being a mother now. And I think, you know, things like there's the beautiful description at the beginning of the book of women in a really cold, windblown playground in Paris. And it describes one woman who's, just given birth, and she's sort of bone tired and sitting there in this sort of stunned state thinking, what the hell's happened to my life? And then the group of nannies all speaking in languages that Louise can't speak. And I felt like there was something I found quite profound in that, in terms of, I don't feel that that's often written about with such attention to detail, and I felt like that sort of interiority of what it is to be a mother and how complicated it is, and all the different things you feel you shouldn't be feeling that you are feeling, and I felt like it had that rawness to it that made it quite exciting to read.
Do you think it will make for a good film?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, in America the book's been called The Perfect Nanny. And I think it reminded me, when I was a teenager, I remember loving that film, The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. Did you ever see that?
No.
Which was about a kind of psycho nanny. And I do slightly feel that the American version might be the psycho nanny version. And I'll be really interested to see the French version. To quote the author, she did give a quote that I thought was really beautiful and really thought-provoking about this book. She said she wanted to explore the parasitic chain of caretaking that inevitably, discreetly, leaves someone alone at the bottom end. And I thought that sent shivers down my spine, and I thought, that is one of the unacknowledged facts of contemporary life that we are quite loathed to talk about or look at in lots of stratospheres, not just nannying, but lots of stratospheres of our life.
This is her second book, and she's a young writer, and I rarely feel this about authors, but I can't wait to see what she does next. I'm learning French, and I was intrigued enough to try to read her first novel, Adele, in French. And with my imperfect understanding of the French language, I can't be entirely sure, but I think it's similarly good. It's got that kind of compulsive quality in the way she holds your attention. And this is a woman who is basically addicted to illicit sexual encounters. And interestingly, this is someone who is much harder to like, and it doesn't have that same kind of universal quality that I felt that Lullaby had. But it's just still, a great read. And I thought, well, okay, so there's that. And then she's evolved onto this. So my goodness, what is she going to write next?
She loves a taboo topic, doesn't she?
So Lullaby, a brilliant book club book by an author to watch. Inspired by Lullaby, here are some recommendations for your next book club read.
So I was casting about, trying to think of something that kind of packed a similar emotional punch to Lullaby. And obviously I couldn't think of other novels where small children get murdered, so
thank God.
But I was glancing around the room and my eye fell on Elena Ferrante's The Days of Abandonment, which I read a while ago, and I suddenly thought, oh gosh, yes, because it does actually have this incredible intensity to it, and it's just the most brilliant writing. When I was reading it, I was almost like, this is so good. Why would anyone ever read anything else other than Elena Ferrante? Because she's so good. And it's much shorter and kind of more compact than the My Brilliant Friend quartet. This is about a woman, and again, actually, it kind of has the kind of slightly, not so much shocking, but the killer opener. One April afternoon, right after lunch, my husband announced that he wanted to leave me. He did it while we were cleaning the table. The children were quarrelling as usual in the next room. The dog was dreaming, growling beside the radiator. And then it goes on. But you're like, what? Or I was anyway. And then it's about that woman and this state of abandonment that she finds herself in and her sort of psychological disintegration. And then what I loved about it was then how she gradually begins to piece things together again. There is also a death in it, not a child, thankfully, but someone or something does die. So if you're the sort of person who needs death in your book club books,
for someone of danger,
there is one in this. But yeah, I thought it was an amazing read, and I do think it's got that powerful emotional intensity. It packs a real punch, and I think would probably make for a very good discussion book.
I'm going to recommend a collection of short stories by a French author named Anna Gavalda. Have you guys ever read anything by Anna Gavalda?
I've never even heard of Anna Gavalda.
Well, all right. The short story collection that I'm recommending is her first book that was ever published, and its title was I Wish Someone Were Waiting for Me Somewhere. And actually, it was given to me by my first boss when I worked at V&A Publishing about 12 years ago. Yeah, I know. He was just like, here, I have this, take it. I have no idea where it came from. He probably just landed on his desk somehow. And it is death-free, but it is set in Paris.
Nice.
It is a light alternative to Lullaby, should you want to read about the glamorous lives that people do lead in Paris to a certain extent. It's very much centered around moments in young women's lives. as well. I don't think there's any mothers in it. I read it with my book club a long time ago now, maybe 7, 8 years ago, early days of my book club, and there was a lot to discuss because there's lots of different moments. So I highly recommend that as a book club book. Just if you want a really heartwarming, lovely read, I recommend Hunting and Gathering by Anna Gavalda as well, which is about 4 friends, and it's happy, and it's about overcoming loneliness and alienation in Paris. So actually a very good accompaniment to Lullaby, but I'm not convinced it would be a great book club book.
More of an antidote.
Yeah.
More of an antidote, yeah.
The therapy you need after
Exactly,
reading Lullaby.
exactly. And I'm thrilled to discover that since the last time I read Anna Gavalda's books, I haven't really kind of checked in on her for a few years, and it looks like there's 2 more books published in English by her recently that I can now read and order promptly after this. So a new author for you guys.
Great. I can't wait to read that. My 2 suggestions are definitely not a soothing respite from Lullaby. They're kind of slightly more of the same. 2 memoirs, both of which have very unflinching, very frank explorations of motherhood, and both of which were very controversial and caused quite a lot of outrage, which was directed at the authors on publication. One is Rachel Cusk's A Life's Work, which was published back in 2001. And it's interesting, I do wonder whether she would have been quite as vilified for her portrait of motherhood if it had come now, but back in 2001 it was considered to be extremely a very damning portrait of motherhood. I don't think it is damning, I just think it's got a kind of honesty to it that really goes into the deep contradictions and the loss of emotional freedom that comes through motherhood for some women, and how she overcame that and what that felt like. So I would strongly recommend A Life's Work by Rachel Cusk. And then the other one, which is, I mean, Laura, if you thought Lullaby was pulpy, this is basically kind of X-rated Heat magazine. But I would recommend Lily Allen's memoir, which I just read, called My Thoughts Exactly. And I read it in a kind of one evening, feeling kind of quite sort of dirty, really, even to be reading it. She exposes herself in an almost slightly terrifying way in terms of the internal workings of her mind, and really the kind of breakdown that she had after she lost her son and had her 2 girls. And she talks really about motherhood taken to its absolute brink, and she also talks about her own upbringing and what is quite a kind of staggering really portrait of childhood neglect that was her own childhood.
Wow.
So yes, I would recommend both those memoirs if you want to have a very 360 uncompromising view into contemporary motherhood, but brace yourselves that they're both quite hard reads.
So as the only non-mother in the room, I feel like you guys could have come up with, one book that you would say, this is a beautiful novel about the joys of motherhood.
For sure.
Can we think of a beautiful novel about the joys of motherhood? Think fast.
Come on, Kate, we've got to now.
I can't think of any. There are no joys in motherhood.
There must be one. We should write one.
Of course there are.
I'm thinking of like Tove Jansson or something like that.
Yes.
But she wasn't a mother,
she
I don't
wasn't
think.
a mother. That was a grandmother, wasn't it, that she goes to stay with?
Yeah. Let me ask you a hard question in return. Given all our arguments, and indeed the arguments of your book club, are you in any way inclined to slightly change your mind or be swayed?
Well, I do think it's a well-written book. I think I rail against almost like the outside of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like
I
don't
the package, or
the package and the decisions that she's made in writing it, but that's the worst type of criticism, really, because it's irrelevant. You can't argue with a book for how it exists in it the way it exists. I think it's really strong and compelling, and I kind of want to poke holes into it, but really, actually, it hangs together very nicely. I just don't like it. My first reaction was the fact that women don't kill children. Women do kill children, obviously, but actually, children are mainly killed by men. And I saw girls and boys at the Royal Court in Sloane Square recently, and without giving too much away, it is a very, very, very similar story, except it ties back to the reality of child murders and the fact that it is men who kill children. Even within that play, she talks about the statistics and about why men kill children and how it's almost always an act of revenge on the woman who's trying to take the children away. I mean, my God, I don't know if we should put this in the podcast. It's going to get relentlessly downbeat. But that murder of the young mother in East London, was it?
Oh yeah, the one who was
with
shot
the crossbow.
with an arrow.
crossbow.
Oh, she was doing the washing up?
Well, she's doing the washing up above her, you know, she's 8 months pregnant. She dies almost instantly, and they deliver the baby by C-section, and he survives. And I mean, that for me is the reality. That should be the worst fear. It shouldn't be nannies killing children, because they just don't do it statistically. I mean, obviously, Leïla Slimani drew on a real life story, but I don't know, when women kill children, when mothers kill children, it's almost always because of postpartum depression and psychosis, and it's a tragedy, but it's not like a deep-rooted cultural threat. It's not women leaving their children. It's just very different. So I think I was railing against the book, which is unfair, because I should have just taken the book on its own terms.
Little Women by Louisa May Alcott.
That's not a nice picture of motherhood.
Mommy?
Well, yeah, she's a great mom, but she's an ideal. It's not from her perspective.
Hey, you asked me for a book that depicted a warm depiction of motherhood. I give you Louisa May Alcott.
Happy family.
I was going to say one final point about Lullaby. I was intrigued when I was sort of prepping this episode. I was looking things up, and I followed the trail to the Krim story, which is the real life family that this happened to in New York. And I was kind of... what's the word? I was sort of astonished, but you know, that couple who lived through that, and they actually had another daughter who was with the mother, so she sort of escaped, and it was the other two children that were ones that were killed. And then this couple, since then, have kind of moved on with their lives. They started this foundation in the name of the children that died. And I watched this amazing video of them talking about this foundation that they've set up, which encourages different types of learning and creativity. And it was so moving and uplifting. And I thought, my goodness, this couple, they've been through the worst hell anyone could possibly imagine. And they've come out the other side, and somehow they are smiling, and they've somehow managed to find something good and something positive. And it just felt like the most extraordinary testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And I just thought, but... you know, Leïla Slimani obviously knew about this story. You know, she cited it as the inspiration behind it, but she chose not to write that story. You know, she very much chose to focus on this sort of dark catastrophe. And I just thought that was interesting. I sort of respected that choice. And it made it more interesting for me the way that she then did it.
Because I did feel that the ending of this book, in my mind... Miriam would have no other choice but to kill herself. That was kind of just my feeling. I was like, if this had happened to you, you would kill yourself. Why would you keep on living?
Yeah.
Yeah. But it is Greek tragedy, isn't it? I mean,
There's your archetypes.
That's what, you know, she wouldn't really want to write about the foundation. You wanted to get, like, you know, the whole thing was, this is an anomaly, but it's symbolic of a power play that is existing, and all the microaggressions that she puts in the book between the two women. And there is a violence that's obviously utterly amplified in the fact that it starts with a double infanticide. But what it is exploring is this violence that happens when you ask two women to kind of engage in this exchange with each other.
Lullaby by Leïla Slimani. The book club book's so good, we couldn't stop talking about it. That's all for this episode. The titles of those recommendations, just in case you missed them, were The Days of Abandonment by Elena Ferrante, I Wish Someone Were Waiting for Me Somewhere by Anna Gavalda, A Life's Work by Rachel Cusk, and Lily Allen's memoir, My Thoughts Exactly.
On our next episode, we'll be discussing The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. This 1957 horror classic has recently been adapted for Netflix, but what did my book club make of the original? Were we scared out of our wits? You'll have to listen in to find out.
Have you just read something that would make for a brilliant book club book? What's the best thing your book club has ever read? What's the worst? Write in and let us know, and we'll feature you on the show. Drop us a line at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, or on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod. And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts.
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.